Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing Gloomhaven, Buttons and Bugs. Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs is the single-player, solo, small box version of Gloomhaven. This is designed by Joe Clipful, who originally, as a fan-made expansion, came up with his own little Gloomhaven. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a small fan-made expansion that he came out with that was bringing you a small box version of Gloomhaven, and then he worked with Cephalofair to go ahead and bring you an actual box version of Gloomhaven, yes, with adorable tiny little miniatures that are, well, beyond minuscule when you go ahead and play with these guys, and they fit on a single card on a little space as they wander on their little adventure. This is not going to be the easiest review to cover as much if you're not familiar with Gloomhaven. I'll try to go into as much as possible, but the problem is I'm trying to talk to two audiences, those who have some sense of how Gloomhaven works, and those who don't, and so it might be a little bit in the middle as far as explaining the game. The basic idea is this is a dungeon crawler for a single player. You're going to pick a character over here, you're going to go on a series of adventures, there are a whole host of these missions to go through, all these various scenarios with all this text and all these rules as far as how the scenarios operate, and then you're going to have these little cards that give you the little maps and the setups, the difficult terrain, the various spots you can't see over, the bombs or traps you can push people in, the actual starting players on that board as far as the enemies you're trying to deal with in the game who are going to be going ahead and actually facing off against you as they wander around and try to deal with you and attack you in the game. This is all being done abstractly on this little card. You're dealing with an enemy AI, which is this card over here. You're dealing with your own little variable set modifier for how your attacks will strike. Again, if you're familiar with Gloomhaven, some of this will be more or less familiar, but the general idea is you have a little miniature, and when I say little miniature, I mean a little miniature. This little guy over here is going to be a miniature trying to accomplish this scenario, which can involve various things, but often will involve taking out the various enemies while trying to survive along the way. You have your own little character, and you have their own little hit points to manage over here. Right now we're on level 1, so we're starting with 10 hit points as the Mind Thief, and then you're going to have your starting hand of 4 cards. Now you could develop and build out this deck over leveling up. You do have your own little, let's go through this cards over here. You have all these cards over here for the various cards you're going to have, and so you can see we have a level 2 card, level 2 card, level 2 over here that are going to be added to your deck that you're going to be building and developing out your character, being able to pick and choose what your hand will look like as you upgrade them in the game. But the general action selection on this game is you're going to be picking 2 cards to go ahead and play, and you're going to be acting the top half of one card and the bottom half of the other card. This is no different than Gloomhaven. A turn goes ahead and has you picking 2 cards and then acting on both the top half of one and the bottom half of another, and then choosing the initiative of one of the cards, which means it's trying to mirror the general structure of Gloomhaven because it's Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs. It's small box Gloomhaven. Past that, for the enemy AI, you're going to go ahead and roll a die. You're going to look at their card, and for each enemy, you're going to go ahead, and you do have multiple boards for when you're dealing with more complex scenarios, but for right now, we're going to go ahead and say, hey, look, we're on the middle track over here, so this bandit guard has an initiative of 50. The good news is I played a 48 here, so I'm going to go before them. And, well, good news is relative, some things you want to go after, but you know some degree of information about the enemies. I know the bandit guards are either going to be 30, 50, or 70, and I know that this is going to be how they're going to act. So, for example, each bandit guard right now is going to move 1 and strike for 2, but they're going to do so after I go ahead and try to get my own shots in. You know, get your revenge in first, so to speak. Meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and activate. So let's go ahead and take one of my people over here. I can do this, control 1 enemy within 3, and make them move 2. So maybe I'll go ahead and do that. I'll bring the fight to me. That way this person over here can slowly move their way towards me, and I won't get struck by them. So I'm going to go ahead and have this guy move 2, 1, 2. We're going to bring him over to me, and then I'm going to attack with the top half of this card, dealing a 2 damage over here, but I'm going to roll for my modifier. So over there, well, that was a little off camera, but the modifier was unfortunately a negative, so I'm going to do -1 damage, and this modifier track moves down 1. Meaning you have little rows of modifiers of how they work, but the modifier is going to slowly move down each time, so it slightly changes up what's there. This is also something that you're going to see. There's different modifier tracks you can go ahead and add to the board as well as you go through the game. So you're going to have the modifier track over there. You have the enemy modifier as far as mixing up their AI. The enemy have 1 shield over here, which means I won't be able to actually deal any damage. My 2 damage less their 1 shield means I deal no damage, but I am going to inflict 2 conditions on them. I'm going to go ahead and inflict poison as well as muddle on the enemy because of the card over here. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and have the enemies activate, where unfortunately this person is now next to me, and now he can attack me. So monsters are going to attack, and they're going to go ahead and roll a modifier as well, and unfortunately, I'm going to slowly get hit by them. Now, I'm not going to go through a full turn of the enemy AI, but basically, you're going to take your actions, the enemy are going to take their actions, and you're trying to accomplish scenario goals, which will often have you killing the enemies. Now, when you're done with those cards, what you're going to do is you're going to take those cards cards, and you're going to flip them to their B side and return them to their hand. This is where, if you're familiar with Gloomhaven, you'll notice we had a smaller hand of cards than you do in Gloomhaven. That's because the cards last twice as long before discarding. When you play an A side card, it's going to return back to your hand on the B side. When you play a B side card, it's going to be discarded, and your hand will slowly deplete. So for example, if next turn I played these two cards, this one will return back to my hand as a B side, and this one will go ahead and get discarded, thus forcing me into a lower amount of decisions until eventually I can go ahead and rest by getting rid of a card along the way, and that's going to be the timer on you. So similar to its big brother Gloomhaven, you are playing with both being mindful of trying to survive in the game, but you're also trying to be mindful of, well, not running out of your time and your card economy in order to be able to accomplish your mission goals. That's the general idea of the game. You have your own cards, you will be upgrading your characters, you're going to have a variety of conditions, you're going to have various modifiers that you're rolling for that will go ahead and shift up whether something misses or does double damage or has +1, +2, -2, all that stuff over there. You're going to have the various enemy AI all captured on the individual scenario card that you're playing as over here. You're going to have the individual enemy AI cards that you're going to roll for to determine what it is that they're going to do, giving you enough predictability that you can work with some degree of, hey, bandits are likely to do this, archers are likely to do that, but also not giving you perfect information at any given time. And with that, it kind of encapsulates the basic Gloomhaven experience in a very small box accessible version, which means it's time to get to the review portion of this, which is going to be hard to review this without in some way being impacted by Gloomhaven as an experience, or Frosthaven, or Jaws of the Lion. There's so much Gloomhaven out there. Let's go ahead and start off the review, starting off with ease of play. I would say that as far as comparing this to any version of Gloomhaven, it's certainly the easiest to dive into. Even easier than Jaws of the Lion, which did a great job of guiding you along the way. So in terms of accessibility, it's the easiest one to play. It's also the shortest, coming in at 20 to 30 minutes per scenario, depending on how thinky you are as far as how you try to min-max every single thing in the game. As far as what I like, don't like, well, before we get to what I don't like and all that, the one accessibility point I'm going to ding it for is they have a rulebook that you can go ahead and learn to play starting rulebook, and then after that, you can go ahead and scan a QR code to get the full rules, which you will need to be able to encounter, well, all the things in the game. You can start off with this and you'll be fine, but you will need those full rules, and I never love it when you have to go to an external resource to gather rules. I understand why it's being done here, so I'm not dinging them on the why, but it still is a negative impact to the experience in a small way. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, starting off with what I like, which is, this is Gloomhaven, but miniature. It's the cheapest version of Gloomhaven to date, it's the smallest version of Gloomhaven to date, it is a travel-friendly version of Gloomhaven, and it encapsulates a lot of what is there to like about the Gloomhaven experience in terms of the strategic depth that this game gives you, while cutting down a lot of the, I shouldn't say unnecessary, cutting out a lot of the extra things, and it gives you a small box version of it. So it manages to capture that strategic feeling. There are going to be elements which I get into that I don't like. A lot of it is inherently reflective of having experienced the bigger box version of Gloomhaven. That's the tricky part here. I'll say that the card restriction feeling is still present, but limited. Rather than having a larger hand of cards that you're working your way through, you have the double-sided card economy, which is a brilliant way of being able to do more with less, or to be able to do, not more with less, being able to do almost as much with less. But there still is the feeling of not being as much card restriction or as much timing or flexibility in the way you can enact things as you would in a typical Gloomhaven game. The sheer amount of game you get in a small, affordable box is very present. Those 20 scenarios, the different characters, the different ways you can go ahead and grow and develop your characters, there's a lot of gameplay in this box, and it also makes for a good intro game into Gloomhaven. But that's also kind of where my things that I like cap out. And again, to be fair to Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs, I am inherently biased by my experience playing the big box version of this game. Playing the full version of this game, where I got to see everything this game does, means that most things I experience in Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs are being viewed from the lens of, but it's not as good as. Because to a large extent, it's not as good as. The biggest pro for it is how much it does with so little, and it does do a lot with so little. I think for me as a player, I'm more looking for how much something does, and I'm less enamored with how little it was able to make that work with. And we'll get more into that in final thoughts. But I think the short version of what I like is this does a lot of things that Gloomhaven does well. It gives you strategic gameplay, character variety, a lot of overall things to enjoy here. My biggest holdback is going to be comparing it to its big brother, which gets to the things we don't like over here, which is, first of all, I don't like the fact that the rulebook's not there. I understand why it's being done. I like having all the rulebooks in the box. It's just the way I prefer things. It's inherently less epic. Everything about the game is less epic, and more linear than the original Gloomhaven, or even Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, or Frosthaven, any of that. There's less decision space on a single card as far as how you can actually operate and get things done. There's much less agency or feeling of agency over here compared to playing through a full scenario. Now, again, to give it credit, it does a lot with very little, but when you've played through, you know, opening up books or putting down map tiles and really going on these full adventures, and then you're limited to, like, you know, a few cards that have not as much space to grow or develop, that just limits how much you can really get done there. I also say I'm not a fan of the flipping cards mechanism. I think it's interesting in terms of what they did and how they were able to do it. I wish there were just twice as many cards and you had a little bit more agency in that sense. Again, it represents a change, I understand that, but coming at it from the full system where you have a lot more agency, by the time you get rid of a B-side card, you're down to 3 cards, there's just much less room for decision space. I think almost everything in this game comes down to the sense that it manages to do a lot of what Gloomhaven does, but it does so with much less room for the decision space that I would otherwise want in this experience. So it really does a lot. It really does. I'm going to be very positive and very, I don't know what the right word for it is, but I'm going to be very positive and complimentary about the things that it does well with so little, while also reflecting the fact that for me, the limitation on the little doesn't do as much. It ultimately gives me the feeling of being Gloomhaven, but less. With less rules overhead, less costs, less table space, less restriction to travel. There's a lot of things that are good about this, but ultimately it still feels like a lesser experience to me, and I can't really stop getting past that. As far as I can see others not liking, the biggest thing I'll say offhand is, first of all, keep in mind, this is a solo game. If you're not looking for a solo experience, if you want that, if you want the full cooperative play you can get from something like Jaws of the Lion, then I'd recommend getting that instead. I'll also say that even though the price point of this is very solid, Jaws of the Lion is a game that you can frequently get your hands on for a very reasonable price point. Like, often I see that thing on a sale on Amazon for like $25 or $30, which for the amount of game and experience you get out of Jaws of the Lion relative to Buttons and Bugs, means that if price is your primary factor, I'd still encourage Jaws of the Lion. Versus if you are looking at this from a sense of travel or accessibility in those areas, or just the small amount of space it takes up, that is more of a compelling reason to get Buttons and Bugs. As far as final thoughts on Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs, it's a weird place for me, because I both think this is doing, I think it's a very, very clever design that manages to do an absolute ton with very little. And to that end, I have nothing but the most positive praise for it. And I'll also say, before getting into my ratings and the things I'm kind of held back on, I will say that historically for me, small box games that try to encapsulate a bigger experience into a small box haven't been the thing I loved as much. I'm a huge fan of small box games. I love the Sprawlopolis line of games. I like a lot of other small box things that give you just a lot of game in a small box. But generally when a game tries to give you an epic experience in a tiny box, and yes, I am inherently referring to the tiny epic line of games, as well as games like Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs, I usually find that for me, I prefer small box games doing small box things. When small box games try to do big box things, I usually find the experience impressive, but not what I'm personally looking for. And so I am coming in with that, I don't want to say bias, but game preference in terms of what I like and don't like in games. And unfortunately, Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs falls into the same category for me. There's nothing wrong with this game. It is an enjoyable game. It's a game I like. It's a game that may well be right for you, especially if you find yourself being someone who does like games like the Tiny Epic line of games, or everything I said does not scare you off. By all means, I think this is well designed and does a lot with very little. For me, I just think I'd recommend Jaws of the Lion as an intro starting point to Gloomhaven that for me will give you a better experience as far as the sheer gameplay dynamics. It will cost a little bit more. The main factor there is going to be the sheer size of it. Like, the travelability of something like Jaws of the Lion is just not there compared to Gloomhaven Buttons and Bugs. But overall, I think for me, I'm kind of stuck feeling like Jaws of the Lion is still the ideal entry into the Gloomhaven universe, and Buttons and Bugs is really for the hardcore Gloomhaven fan who wants a travel-friendly version of Gloomhaven. So for me, this is a 3 out of 5. There's nothing wrong with it, but it does live in the shadow of its older brother, and I have a hard time getting past that. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, I recommend 20 Strong. If you want a game that's going to give you a small box experience but does a lot with it in a way that I think more matches the nature of what it's trying to do, I'm a huge fan of 20 Strong and the solo gameplay of rolling dice, of taking down a bunch of enemies, of trying to work your way towards the boss along the way. And if you're not afraid of a larger experience and you want something a bit more card-driven or whatnot, Slay the Spire is going to be a fascinating game that works well solo and works well multiplayer as you go through a series of enemies until you eventually take down a series of bosses across 3 arcs of the game. And in any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.